Welcome to the New Books Network.
Welcome to the New Books Network. My name is Joanne Kwai. I'm a PhD candidate at the Department of Geography, Media and Communication at Karlsson University in Sweden. Today, I've invited two colleagues from my department, Professor Henrik Örnebring and Professor Michael Karlsson, to talk about their co-authored book, Journalistic Autonomy, The Genealogy of a Concept, published by the University of Missouri Press in 2022. Henrik and Michael, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
I'm very excited to have the opportunity to conduct this interview in person in this podcast recording studio we have at Karlsson University, and also holding a physical and signed copy of the book. But before we dive into the book, I would like to begin by some introduction of the authors. So would you please share with our audience what is your academic background and what led you to your current research interests? Henrik?
Yeah, sure. My academic background is that I actually did my undergraduate degree here at Karlsson University. So I am born and raised here. Then I went to Gothenburg and did my PhD there. And then I moved abroad. I moved to England and I lived and worked there for 11 years. Most of the time I spent at the University of Oxford at the Reuters Institute. And then in 2013, I came back here. And in that time, I've been interested in many different aspects of journalism research, comparative studies of journalism, journalistic work, journalistic professionalism, journalism history, and sort of all of that taken together led me, I think, to the issue of journalistic autonomy or independence.
Mm-hmm. Michael?
Yeah, I started out at Mid Sweden University at Sundsvall back in the 90s. I did my undergraduate there and my master also. And then I started as a teaching assistant at the department, and I was accepted as a PhD student at Lund University, and I got my PhD there in 2006. And I moved to Karlstad in 2008, and I have been here ever since. And my research trajectory started out with an interest of how digitalization would impact journalism. And when I did this back in the early 2000s, it wasn't much of an impact, but obviously quite a lot has happened since. And I'm moving away from that sort of starting point and thinking about more of the bigger concepts in journalism about norms and values and trust, transparency, and with this book also autonomy.
Mm-hmm. And speaking about this book, Journalistic Autonomy, shall we begin by a definition of autonomy? What is autonomy and what does it mean in the context of journalism?
We usually say that it has like kind of two levels. So autonomy, that's like the fancy scientific way of saying independence. It's on the one hand, it's autonomy on, let's say, like the macro or the institutional level, that journalism as a whole, as an institution, as something that a lot of people do, should be independent from various outside influences. And then on the micro level or individual level is that the individual journalist should be able to do their job without interference from outside agents. And then you can say that the whole point of the book is sort of discussing this issue of outside agents. Like who is outside journalism and what is outside journalism and what is inside journalism. Because there's some things that journalists want to be independent from and other things that they don't care that they're dependent on, if you understand what I'm saying. Michael, maybe you can make more sense of this.
Yeah, that's the definitional issue is something that we have been struggling with a bit. We can't pin it down. So we use the independent concept as a sounding board that we depart from. We see autonomy as having both elements of independence and dependency. And we are, as Henrik said, more interested in the dependency part of autonomy, because you can't be independent from everything. And if you are, you can't have an impact on the environment around you. And that's a part of journalism's goals, is to inform the public in a way it can hold elected politicians accountable.
Mm-hmm. And in this book, the chapters are mainly structured by these players or forces or actors.
Mm-hmm.
Who decided on this and how did you come to these categories?
Yeah, that's a good question, because when we started writing this book, and Henrik was the instigator, so to speak, we thought we were writing another book, and we ended up writing this book instead. So this was a bit in the process. We found that this was a way to organize it, and that coincides with our developed understanding of autonomy, one could say.
Yeah, just to like maybe a bit more specifically answer your question and sort of go on from what Micke said. The beginning, we thought that we would write like a thin kind of definitional guidebook on what journalistic autonomy is, like maybe, like 120 pages suitable for students, and you have the book in front of you. It's considerably bigger than 120 pages, right? So it's like, it's like a massive book. Our publishers hated us because it's...
Yes, we have cut 100 pages also.
We have cut 100 pages. But anyway, when we started out, we thought, so what these actors or forces, how did we come up with them? Well, the first were easy, because a lot of the discussion about autonomy is that, well, journalism should be autonomous or independent from the state, and it should be independent also in some magical way from the market. Yeah, that's what a lot of previous writings on autonomy have focused on. But as we were talking and thinking about it, we realized that sort of independence comes up in relation to like a lot of other societal fields or institutions that have a relation to journalism. For example, you should be independent from the state, but the state isn't quite the same as like political parties or political interest groups. And obviously there's like quite a lot of historical research that shows how important it was that journalists became independent from political parties, for example. And then we realized, looking at the ethical guidelines of journalism, or like the ethical rules, that a lot of those have to do with being sort of very independent on the micro level from the sources, like the people that you talk to or interview, that they should not be able to sort of dictate the agenda. So a lot of things sort of came out of that. And then we were discussing sort of more recent issues like technology, for example.
And AI, artificial intelligence, and then discovered journalism's ambivalent positions towards technology, whereas like the printing press is like a natural and friendly technology, while radio was first unfriendly and then was incorporated in journalism, and then TV was the threat, and then the online was the threat, but then become naturalized. So, and that we think also casts an interesting light on the self-understanding and what it's supposed to be independent from, but actually is dependent on as you look at these processes over time.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned this historical perspective. I think it's very much hinted in the subtitle of the book, The Genealogy of a Concept. Why did you decide to do a genealogy, and how did you execute it?
Yeah, the genealogy decided to do us, I think. It came out of our readings. And as Henrik said before, we thought that we were going to write a very definitional book. But as we tried to unpack this concept, we needed to go back, what was said in the beginning in the independence of the state, and it wasn't independent at all. And when did it become independent? Well, that was when there was a market. So it became dependent on the market to become independent from the state. And then it wanted to be dependent from the market, and so on. So we needed to go back in history to sort of unpack why we are where we are right now.
Obviously in the book, like we talk about how genealogy, there's like an everyday understanding of genealogy, which is that you do kind of a family history. Part of our genealogy is that a history of the family of journalism, if you will. Like journalism contains many things, and a lot of these things that journalists should be autonomous from comes from like actually different parts or different aspects of journalism. And then there's the more theoretical aspect of genealogy, which we of course get from Friedrich Nietzsche, which was then developed by Michael Foucault. Nietzsche's book, The Genealogy of Morals, which is kind of an attempt to kind of write the history of how morals come about. We thought, why not be, there could be worse things to be inspired by than Nietzsche and Foucault, right? Yeah. So it kind of went on from there.
Yeah, and another thing is that the genealogy approach allowed us to write in a different way that we usually write as academics, because journal articles are, heavy formatted, a bit stale. So we use this as an excuse to be mischievous.
Yeah, that is actually true. That I don't know how sort of familiar you are with philosophy, but like obviously like Nietzsche is one of the most studied philosophers. So there's quite a lot of people who have written about like his approach to writing. Like a genealogy in like his sense is meant to be provocative. It's meant to be non-traditional. It's meant to sort of see things from a different point of view. This all sounds, I don't know, very sort of pretentious and high-minded, but for us it was really like a working necessity, more or less. It was like just as you say, in order to like understand what we were even writing the book about, we had to go back in time and sort of do it in this way and look at it afresh, if you will.
Yeah, and related to that, since you mentioned it was an opportunity for you to almost like mischief, which chapter did you had most fun writing?
Well, we are main responsible for different chapters. Some chapters were excruciating to write, but I liked the results, and some were more like pleasant to write. But I think if I is to pick out one thing, it's the defecating mechanical duck I had the most fun with.
Yeah, that's great. That was like all Micke. But as I said, we took main responsibility for like separate chapters, but then in the end, like we ended up writing parts of like each other's chapters anyway. So it's a very sort of organic process. Like, I don't know, I sort of have like two favorites that I worked on a lot, where the first one is that is about autonomy from the state, because I got to sort of geek out and write a lot about obscure Swedish 18th century philosopher Peter Forsskål. As Micke would say, it's very on brand for me to be like interested in like obscure philosophers and stuff.
I can also reveal it. Those 100 pages that went missing were about Peter Forsskål, most of them.
This is sadly very close to the actual truth. Yes. Also, the second favorite, since I've been very influenced in my research by these kind of classic workplace ethnographies in journalism, the newsroom ethnographies by like Gay Tuckman, Mark Fishman, Herbert Gans. It was also very enjoyable to like write the chapter about autonomy in the workplace and sort of get a chance to like revisit or redefine those issues a bit. That was fun.
Yeah, I can just add that the mechanical duck is about technology. That didn't come
exactly.
across.
Yeah.
I was going to make a clarification on that, but you were saying that this kind of format is very different from the journal articles, which now I come to understand that you always have to make an argument. Is there any kind of like key arguments you are making with this book, or some of the key contributions you would like to highlight?
I mean, I think Micke hinted at the argument at the beginning that a lot of the self-image and self-understanding of journalism comes from understanding journalism as that it should be like cut off from the rest of the world. It's like independence is when there is no one telling you what to do. You don't have to care about profits. There is no state censoring you. There are no political parties telling you what to do. That independence or autonomy in the journalistic self-image has been about keeping things out of journalism. But what we want to show is that it's really not about keeping things out. It's about sort of negotiating your dependence, because as a matter of fact, journalists are dependent on all these things. They are dependent on the state. They are dependent on the market. So autonomy becomes a way, if you will, of like deciding what level of dependence is acceptable.
Yeah, from whom?
And from whom, and in what way. So like that's the contribution, that like maybe we shouldn't, we should talk more about journalistic dependence than journalistic independence.
Yeah. And I would also like to add that in that context, the way we introduce the membrane instead of walls, I think is a good way to shortcut to think about it differently, rather than the wall to keep things out is a membrane that some things through and some things on the outside, and then we can start investigating what gets in and why, and what stays out and why.
Yeah, it's a metaphor we get from like biology, basically, that in journalism, the relationship to the outside world has often been described using the term of the wall. There should be like a wall between editorial and the commercial side. There should be like a wall keeping out political influence and so on and so forth. So, you know, like a wall, right? It keeps things out, and the only way to get things in is to like tear down the wall entirely, right? But just as Mickey said, no, it's not a wall. It's like a cell membrane. A cell membrane lets certain things through and not others. And the cell has to have a membrane in order to be separate from its environment, but it also needs to let things through, because a cell can't function without like oxygen, without nutrition, and so on and so forth. So that's the changed perspective that we want to contribute.
Mm-hmm. And I want to circle back a little bit on the definition of autonomy, because you also made this differentiation between autonomous from and autonomous to, and you had these 4 propositions in relation to autonomy. Like autonomy has to be relational, and it has to have boundary, and it has to be have a purpose, and it also implies agency.
Yes.
How did you land it up on these kind of propositions?
We needed to go very broad when we read up on autonomy, because in most research fields, including journalism, autonomy is a God term that's just there and it's good, and you say that autonomy is good, and then you move on to discuss something more in particular. So we read up on a lot of how other fields discussed autonomy, and the fields that we drew most inspiration from was, astrobiology. When does life start to exist? Because that's a very definitional thing. We also drew some from healthcare and drug studies, because when people become addicted to drugs, they are not autonomous in the sense that they pursue the goals that they want, but they have been like overtaken by a force. And from that, we started to tease out the things that were overlapping in these fields, but also discussing various forms of autonomy, like the physical autonomy and the mental autonomy. And the third, which I can't remember right now.
Yeah. And we're discussing the journalistic autonomy in relation to the state, political interest, market sources, workplace, and audiences and technology. Do you see any major difference, like how journalism has like a, say, higher degree of autonomy, lower degree in relation to this outside forces?
I think the whole book is about how this has sort of changed historically, and that obviously a lot changed when like the business model of journalism changed. It used to be that journalism in the literature was described as a sort of a profession of strong autonomy or like strong professionalism, comparing to like other professional groups and so on and so forth. But as it turns out, journalists, you can only be autonomous as long as you make money. So I think another thing that sort of emerges from this is that journalism actually historically has had sort of a relatively weak and reactive autonomy rather than a strong one. It has been possible to like make it strong, essentially because they were such successful businesses. And when they weren't successful businesses, then a lot of this kind of strong autonomy disappeared. Like we have a big discussion, for example, about native advertising, and again referencing the wall, that it used to be that it would be completely unthinkable that the sort of marketing or business department of the newspaper should have any influence over the editorial side. And now it's like routine in many news organizations that these people sit in on the same meetings and they decide things jointly and so on and so forth, which is, of course, because like they have to, because they have to like make money so that they can pay the journalists. But it's just, it was the very definition of journalistic autonomy that they did not do that. It was like totally not allowed. And now it's not only allowed, but like encouraged.
Yeah, and unproblematic. And this change took place over a time period of 10 to 15 years.
It just took 10 to 15 years, and then that was gone, essentially, which is like a very rapid historical change, actually.
And I also like that in the beginning of the book, you made a disclaimer that you are situated in a Swedish university. This book's examples largely draw from the context in the US, UK, and Sweden. I would like to ask, what do you think this kind of focus on this part of the empirical world has influenced this book? And how well do you think journalistic autonomy as a concept can travel or translate to other contexts, probably less liberal democratic?
Yeah, good question. If we start with the first part of the question, part of the answer is that while we are aware of our Western-centeredness, also the journalistic field and its norms comes from the Western hemisphere. So I think there is no way of discussing journalism without taking that into account. And especially a lot of research comes out from the United States and Europe, I would say. So it's a natural starting point. But I think that a lot of the spirit in the book is trying to lock up that, or like make it less stale and open up for other parts or other forms of dependency, which does not necessarily follow a Western trajectory. I think I'm not saying that we arrive at like very oppositional standpoint in terms of how we view journalism or its norms, but I think it's maybe like a small step on the way.
And I do think, again, it's a good point. And I've actually been thinking, I haven't told Michael this yet, but if we ever have the energy to do a second edition of this book, I would certainly like to write more about like journalism in like totalitarian and authoritarian regimes, which is something that we don't go into very much, but where many of these relationships, not just a relationship to the state, but like also to sources, to the market, to political interests, is very different. That is something that we sort of, and we even sort of talked a bit about like having more on it, but like it was like 500 pages already.
Yeah.
So we had to like save that, and we were like US centric for a reason. In order to like also critique that this is like a US-centric field.
And also could add add that when journalism, saw the first like kernels of journalism saw the day of light, that was in the totalitarian context.
For sure.
Yeah. So the first 250 years or so of journalism grew up in a totalitarian context. So
like monarchy and like like
religious
absolute the age of absolutism, as it's called, like where you have this idea that a monarch or a religious authority has absolute power. That was the context for journalism for a long time.
And you mentioned that the change of journalism's business model has brought a lot of different kind of dynamic in changing the journalistic autonomy. And even if we think about just comparing US and Sweden, the business model of journalism is very different. So do you have any take on that? Like when in comparison, like how journalistic autonomy manifests differently in these two different contexts, even both situated in the quote unquote Western democracy?
Oh, you could certainly see the public service media model or public service news, which historically it's not from Sweden, but it's historically very strong here, and it's like an important part of the media and journalism landscape. You could view that as that is kind of another way of trying to cope with the issue of autonomy.
Yeah.
But where you see that, okay, in like a small market, the market might not like satisfy all the sort of informational needs. Here, the idea is the opposite, that like the state needs to take some kind of responsibility for doing that, with all its attendant problems. Of course, we know as students of public service in history that it has been like quite sort of paternalistic, that public service has had trouble dealing with contentious political issues and so on and so forth. But that would certainly be a difference. That's another thing for like if we're ever allowed to write a book that's like bigger, we would also put in more maybe about like public service, which there isn't very much about now. But particularly public service as a way of solving the autonomy riddle.
Yeah, in a different way.
In a different way, not necessarily a better way, but like a different way.
Mm-hmm. And now I have two like journalists and scholars sitting in front of me. I do want to ask, based on this book or your years of experience researching this field, what do you think, in your opinion, journalism as an institution should be like? I feel like there is an implied norm or ideal we're trying to achieve. Do you have an ideal image of what journalism should be like as an institution, I guess?
Not really.
Well,
No.
That was interesting. Not really. I was going to say I certainly have. So that's why
But maybe should I start then? It doesn't have a...
Yeah, you can start.
Yeah, all right. In the end chapter, we make an like sort of argument, but I'm not primarily interested in journalism. I'm interested in what constitutes a good information environment for a democracy to work. For that, journalism can have a role or it can not have a role. And maybe not even journalism that's the most important institution. Maybe it's like the schools instead, or the educational institution. So I'm happily leaving the ideal model to other people. So over to you, Henrik.
Yeah, sure. Because I think one thing that became increasingly evident to me while writing this book is that in order for journalism to like have this democratic role that we all hope that it would have, then journalism need to much more explicitly grapple with its own role in basically maintaining social inequality and social injustice. Not just that, journalists, they like their watchdogs and they like, can topple politicians and like be critical of government and so on and so forth. And here's actually an advantage of looking at the US case, because I think in the US case, it's obvious that not only has journalism often failed to do that, but journalism has sort of actively helped and actively supported an unjust society. Like I am thinking particularly of the issue of like racial inequality in the US, which is also something that we write about in the book, that like, newspapers in the South in the US historically supported lynchings, like did not write about the civil rights movement, actively tried to like smear civil rights leaders and so on and so forth. And as long as journalism doesn't grapple with that past, that they don't have this like brilliant sort of self-image as defendants of democracy, that they've actually, news organizations have at times helped support an unjust social order. And the normative conclusion there is that journalism shouldn't do that.
Yeah.
Like it shouldn't support an unjust social order.
Yeah, we could put it in another way. It has been pretty poor at times at achieving the goal it has set out for itself.
Yeah. I also find this very interesting. I recall from the chapter when you mentioned journalist autonomy and in relation to the sources. So we always say journalism has to be balanced and include all kinds of voices, but journalists at a certain time had to justify to include black voices, and because it's not considered neutral in a setting that is racist. So yeah, it's a very stimulating to think about that, like who defines what even is neutral, and this kind of rules and norms are written into the journalistic guidelines and codes that they have.
Thank you.
I would like to also ask, because been hearing about the institutional crisis of journalism, and I almost got a hint from what Michael was saying that journalism as an institution, do you think it is worth preserving or saving?
I think it's worth preserving the function it claims to have.
Yeah.
But I would like to say that I think it's quite obvious that journalism is retreating from that function, and not only by its own terms, but because journalism is shrinking in its reach. So less people are, bothered by journalism because they don't want to pay for it. So even though the institution is performing in a sufficient way, it is of less relevance than it used to be like 10, 20, 30 or 40 years ago.
And if we are to facilitate a better informational environment for democracy, what do you think can be done within journalism and outside of journalism?
Good question. I think, first of all, what the book points out is that journalism needs support by other institutions. And it has been so throughout the history. And when other institutions are trying to hinder journalism, they are quite successful in doing so. So that's one thing. Journalism's problem is not for journalism to solve itself. So that's one thing. And another thing I think is a point of the book is, while we are happy to point out what journalism should do, but in our definition of autonomy, journalism and journalists need to find out what their goals are, because that's a part of autonomy, to pick out a goal and methods to achieve that goal. So even though politicians and researchers and citizens are criticizing journalism, to be autonomous, they need to figure out what they want to do and try to achieve that.
Yeah. Sort of just to continue what Micke said, that it's, if politicians of like many different political camps decide that journalism is not to be trusted and says that journalism is not to be trusted and so on and so forth, then it's very difficult for journalism to defend itself, if you will. So some of the things of how journalism should be is unfortunately outside the power of journalism to do anything about. It needs the support of other societal institutions, and if the political sphere doesn't fully support journalism, it's going to be very difficult. However, in terms of what should journalism do in relation to the thing that I said before about journalism being complicit in an unjust social order, then one thing that journalistic organizations or news organizations certainly can do is to make much more of an effort to be more diverse. That's actually something that journalism can do, that, in terms of hiring practices and so on and so forth. Just as at one point in time, women were not allowed in the newsroom. They couldn't work as journalists. Then they came into the newsrooms and could become journalists, and journalism was all the better for it. Just as journalism has sort of gotten better at actually reflecting society, the more diverse it has gotten. So it's just a matter of trying to continue to do that, because that is something that will help journalism, I think, fulfill the values it has set itself. It's not necessarily on the one hand, diversity is an important value in and of itself, but it also has an instrumental character to it, that this will actually help journalists be more truthful, be more fair, be more neutral, if you will. So that would be one thing that I think that's within the power of news organizations to change. That's something that they can do.
What about the public, the so-called journalists serving the public interest? From the public's perspectives, is there anything they can do?
Well, you've done more research on this and what the public thinks, Michael.
Yeah, what the public thinks is one thing. What they should do is another thing.
For sure.
But I think they should, pay subscription fees and watch journalism when it's good, because it's not always good. So I think that's the role of the public, to set aside that little amount of money and that amount of time that it's needed to keep up with the current events.
So it's use the power they have as consumers to reward journalism.
Yeah, and as citizens to raise issues that they find important, and things like that. And actually, if politics supports journalism, if the market supports journalism, sources do it, the public does it, then it's easier to be a good journalist and fulfill the goals that you have. But if everyone is tearing on you, it's more difficult. And what the point with autonomy is that you should be able to be autonomous even if times are hard. Otherwise, you are not autonomous. Then you're just following the stream.
Understand. So I have taken much of your time and have this one last question. Would you please share with us what are some current projects you're working on, Henrik?
So when writing this book, the Autonomy book, as I said, one thing that started to interest me more and more was this sort of legacy of racial injustice in U.S. journalism in particular. And so I am currently now writing a biography of Thelma Burlack Boozer, who was a noted black journalist, a journalist in the black press during the sort of heyday of the black press between like 1925 and 1945. And she was also the first black person in the U.S. to be a professor of journalism and lead the School of Journalism at Lincoln University in Jefferson City, Missouri. So I'm writing about her life and her journalism as a way of like highlighting these issues of like race and like black and white in journalism.
Michael?
Yeah, after we wrote this book, I wrote another book that was about transparency. So that was actually came out before this book. That process was a bit faster. And now I'm just beginning in a research project together with my colleagues here at Karlsson University, Cornelia Branter and Elisabeth van Koevering, and Raoul Ferrer-Cornel at Stavanger University. And we are looking at the infrastructure of the media, the Nordic media systems, and try to figure out what kind of different actors and organizations that are involved in that, to see the foundations of the public sphere, one could say.
Thank you so much again for being here today, and I look forward to reading more of your research outputs, and especially welcome you back to the New Books Network when the new books are out. And to our listeners, you can find links to connect with Henrik, Michael, and me, and also to the book in the show notes. Thank you so much again for listening. Until next time.